One issue I have found with beginner quilters and even some more advanced quilters is how to get their borders on, how to square up their quilt, and how to get their quilt to lay flat and their borders to lay flat. So what I'm going to show you today is I'm going to show you how I get my quilt to lay flat, how to measure for your borders, and how to pin your borders on so that everything lays nice and flat. And you have a nice square quilt. Okay, so here I have a piece of fabric. I'm going to pretend this is my quilt top, and I'm going to, in order to square it up before I put my borders on, because if you don't have a square border in the beginning, you're not going to have a square quilt when you finish. So I'm going to find the center of my quilt by just folding it in half, giving it a couple little creases, and then I'm going to fold my ends to the center of the quilt, just like this. And you can see I've purposely made these a little bigger. It doesn't quite match on each side, it's wider, and that's usually what happens with quilts. And so I have to make the outside of the quilt, the outside edges of the quilt, equal the center of the quilt in order to get it to lay flat. So I'm going to recut some of my edges so that the edges are the same as the center of the quilt. And sometimes I'll take my ruler and I'll lay it across and square it up towards the center. Of course, the quilt is going to be bigger, so you're going to have to start at the top or start at the bottom. And now I'm going to do the same thing to the top. I'm going to make it equal to the center of the quilt. And I'm going to turn it around and do the same thing on the other side to make it square. So again, I'm going to measure from the center and cut a little bit on each side. And now I'm going to try and I'm going to look and see now if it's the same in the center as it is on the outside. Now if it's off just a little bit, I'm not going to worry about it. But if it's off like 1/4 of an inch on each side, that's a lot of fabric to have to put together when you're putting your borders on. So I'm going to do it in both directions because I have to figure out, is it square going in both directions? So I'm going to fold it in half again, going the other way. I'm going to fold my edges to my center, like this, and then I'm going to check to see if it's square going that way. Now this one is a little bit short on each side, but it's not so much that I can't ease something in when I'm doing my borders. Okay, so I'm not going to worry about squaring that up. I do want to make sure that my corners are square, and what I do is I take my ruler and I put it up on the corner, and it should be a 90-degree angle on all sides of my quilt. So I would check that with all 4 corners of my quilt to make sure that the corners are square. Okay, so I'm going to check all 4 corners to make sure they're square. If they're not, I'm going to trim a little bit off if I have to. Then I'm going to check this other corner to make sure it's square and it's lined up along the edges, so that one's okay too. So now I'm going to get ready to put my border on. Now when I first started quilting, I measured my border, and if it was a big quilt, I'd have to use math. Okay, so you have to either, if it's really big, sometimes you have to take your strip, fold it in half and fold it in half again so you have quarters, so then you have to take your quilt measurement and divide it by 4 and all that kind of stuff. But I found a really fast method for putting my borders on. So I'm getting ready to sew my borders on. I usually sew the long side on first. So what I do is I lay my quilt either on the floor, or I have a quilting machine, so I lay it across the bar on my quilting machine. And I take my strip, so I've cut my border strip, and I lay it across the center of the quilt. Remember, we took everything and we put it towards the center of the quilt because that's the measurement I'm going to use. So I lay my border strip across the center of my quilt, and then I just take a pair of scissors and I make a little clip right next to the quilt on both sides. Okay, and then I can take my strip and put it on my cutting surface, and then take my ruler, and wherever the clip is, I'm going to line it up along the line of my ruler, so because I want to have a square end, and I'll clip it. I'll cut it with my rotary cutter. I'll do the same thing with the other side. Find my little clip. Oh, there it is. Okay. So I take it, and then I'm going to Square that end up also. Line the edge of the border with my ruler. Okay, and then I'm going to cut that edge. Now, so now I've got a border that's going to match my quilt. So now the important thing is you want to pin. Pin, 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 pin. If you just lay this on here and you've got a really long border, if you just sew it, that border will stretch and it won't end up where it's supposed to be. So it's really important to pin your borders. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to fold my border in half, and I'm going to find out where the mid section of my quilt is, and I'm going to fold that in half. And then I'm going to match my border strip to my quilt where it matches in the middle. And then I'm going to put a pin in the center and match that, and then I'm going to pin the edges. Now this is where you could, if you have to, sometimes it's still not perfect, you can ease your fabric in, your borders in when you're sewing. So to do that, you're going to put a lot of pins in. Okay, so I'm going to pin each end. And then what I do is I find the center. Okay, so I'm going to find the center between these two pins. I'm going to put a pin there. Same thing on the other side, find the center. And I just keep doing this. Now, because this is a small sample, you're going to have, and you're using a bigger quilt, I would just keep finding the center. And then I would just keep putting pins in. So what I end up usually is my pins are about 4 inches apart. And then I know I've got my borders on really nice and flat. Okay, so then I would go ahead and sew my border on with 1/4 inch, press it, do the same thing with the other side, and when I'm done, I'm going to do the exact same thing. I'm going to lay my border strip across the center after I've sewn on my 2 side borders, and then I'm going to pin them and then sew them on. And since your quilt center is square, then when you put your borders on, those will be square too. And so this is really a really important part of putting your quilt together, and it's the best way I've found to make your quilt lay nice and flat.